in Myanmar. How does that look today?
Grim. Absolutely grim. I'm here. JFM is not. There's an empty chair here. And that's not a coincidence.
Authoritarian regimes and dictators prop each other up politically and financially for their own gain. They are partners in crime. Since the 2021 illegal coup attempt, the military has waged a nationwide campaign of terror. Our priority is impact, blocking the military's access to funds, arms, and aviation fuel.
Welcome to the interview series, How to Mobilize Change. My name is Telda Mawarire. During 4 30-minute conversations, I will take a deep dive into the stories of the Right Livelihood Laureates. Joining me today is Justice for Myanmar, one of the Right Livelihood Laureate winners. They will be joined by Montse Ferrer from Amnesty International for this conversation. Congratulations to JFM and welcome to Montse. For safety reasons, Justice for Myanmar will be represented by an artificially intelligent generated voice through pre-recorded answers. The empty chair represents Justice for Myanmar, who, for safety reasons, are not able to join us in the studio. Joining me here in studio is Montse Ferrer from Amnesty International, who has collaborated with Justice for Myanmar. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
I will start with Justice for Myanmar. What does receiving the Right Livelihood Award mean for you?
Thanks for having us. Receiving the Right Livelihood Award reaffirms that the world has not forgotten the Myanmar people's struggle, courage, and determination to build a future without military tyranny. This recognition belongs to the people of Myanmar, who have bravely resisted a brutal and illegal junta for nearly 5 years, including those killed defending justice and democracy. It reflects their extraordinary courage, sacrifice, and dignity. The award also sends a clear message to governments and corporations still enabling the junta. The world is watching. End your complicity in the junta's atrocity crimes. Finally, it strengthens our resolve to dismantle this criminal military. We are not alone in the fight for peace, justice, and human dignity. From Palestine, Ukraine, and East Turkestan to Sudan, our struggles are shared, interconnected, and urgent.
Let us perhaps start from the beginning. What pushed you to create Justice for Myanmar?
We founded Justice for Myanmar in 2019 after the military's genocide against the Rohingya, recognizing that its impunity was enabled not only by a rigged political system, but also by a vast financial network it built over decades. The military operates like a criminal cartel, seizing public assets and profiting from illicit economies and global cyber scam networks run with trafficked labor. This system enriches corrupt generals and finances mass-scale brutality. After the 2021 coup attempt, our work intensified. The military seized lucrative state enterprises while nationwide resistance grew. Whistleblowers and leaks helped us expose how foreign and local companies, banks, and arms suppliers provided the junta with revenue, weapons, equipment, and aviation fuel, enabling war crimes and crimes against humanity. We saw that ending impunity requires cutting these lifelines. By exposing the financial networks sustaining the junta and supporting a genuine democratic transition, we aim to dismantle the institution responsible for generations of violence and injustice.
So how do you decide which cases to pursue?
Our priority is impact, blocking the military's access to funds, arms, and aviation fuel. We pursue a case when we have or can gather credible evidence. We review what activists and media have already published and assess whether we can add something new or complementary. We also evaluate whether there are viable pressure points, since every investigation must contribute to real change. That change may come through public pressure, potential sanctions, or international law violations, or by targeting shareholders and directors who can be pushed to act. Sometimes our goal is to publish evidence needed for new sanctions designations. We also work in a solidarity with others, supporting and complementing their efforts, so our coordinated calls have greater impact.
Montse, I'll come to you now. You have collaborated with Justice for Myanmar. Tell me about the kind of work that they were doing, your collaboration, and what is it that led to this partnership?
Sure. So when we first met was early 2020. As they just said, they started in 2019, but they went public in 2020. So they had just gone public. We'd just heard of them. And they came to us with an explosive leaked document. It had been leaked, unclear by who, but it was a military document that showed how high top military officials, commanding officers, but also battalions, basically every branch of the Myanmar military, how they were direct shareholders of a company called MEHL, which is the largest business conglomerate in Myanmar. At the time, Amnesty had already documented atrocity crimes by many of those individuals and battalions in the Myanmar military. And so what we were asked is to triangulate that. We had the MEHL, we had the Myanmar military, and the third question was, which international and regional companies are partnering with the Myanmar military? And so that's the part that we came in to do. That's how we first met and how we started to work together.
So Justice for Myanmar is a completely anonymous organization. How were you able to work with a covert organization on issues such as this?
It's going to sound unbelievable, but it's true. I've never met anyone at JFM. I've never seen their faces. I don't know their names. I don't even know where they're based. So I really know nothing about them. And yet, I joined Amnesty over 5 years ago. They're my closest partner, I would say. So how did that happen? I was thinking about it, and I think it's because on a personal level, so on a human level, but also on an institutional level, our values, our ethics, our objectives are aligned. We both want human rights violations to end. But I also think it's that value and the ethics. And of course, at the beginning, it was tough. So questions of how can we ensure their safety? Because we really don't know anything about them, to how can we trust the information they're sharing with us? I mean, once you want to verify or authenticate evidence, the first question you always ask is who's behind, who's the source? And when you don't even know the source, how do you do that? So those initial questions were tough, but after that, which we obviously resolved, it's been like any relationship. We've been nurturing it through the years, and to this day, we do that.
That's amazing that you are able to do this and keep their identity anonymous. I think I would like to find out a bit more context now about the situation in Myanmar before we come to the actual investigations. So I'll turn to Justice for Myanmar again. So before we turn to the specific investigations, help us to understand what the situation in Myanmar is like right now.
Since the 2021 illegal coup attempt, the military has waged a nationwide campaign of terror, mass arrests, killings, indiscriminate airstrikes, torture, sexual violence, and the burning of villages. Children are increasingly among the victims. Despite this, the junta has failed to gain territorial control, while revolutionary organizations now run functioning administrations across large areas. A courageous, bottom-up effort to build a federal democracy is underway. The stakes are high. The military is holding a sham election to gain false legitimacy, backed by countries including China, Russia, Belarus, and Vietnam. Over 30,000 political prisoners, including elected leaders, remain jailed. In areas the junta controls, it is detaining people under draconian election laws to crush opposition. But the public rejects both the coup and the sham vote. Governments must stand with the people of Myanmar, reject the junta's illegitimate election and its results, and support the struggle.
Thank you so much. Montse, would you like to add, perhaps from your view, and give us some context, the humanitarian and human rights situation in Myanmar? How does that look today?
Grim. Absolutely grim. I mean, in addition to what JFM has just said, Amnesty and others have documented a number of human rights violations across the country. We're talking specifically, especially the conflict. It has escalated, and this year, 2025, has seen a record amount of airstrikes that have, many of them, amounted to war crimes. We're talking about the targeting of civilian infrastructure like hospitals, schools. There have been a lot of schools targeted this year with a lot of children being killed, religious buildings and other civilian infrastructure. In addition, as also mentioned, torture and ill treatment in prison continues. We've been able to document a number of deaths in custody this year because of the lack of healthcare within prisons. Also, earlier this year, there was a massive earthquake in Sagaing region, the central Myanmar, that had a huge impact, which was coupled immediately thereafter by the cuts of US aid and other cuts of aid, which have made it even more hard for civilians, internally displaced persons, refugees living across the border. In addition to that, I mean, it really is a terrible human rights and humanitarian situation. We've also documented how scamming compounds, which is a phenomenon in Southeast Asia, but one of the hotspots is Myanmar, have been operating throughout the country, and in many cases, the Myanmar military is directly benefiting or allowing them to flourish. And finally, we've also documented how violations have also taken place by Arakan Army, which is fighting the Myanmar military in Rakhine State, where the Rohingya population have had to flee, and they are also responsible for serious human rights violations.
I would like to turn now to the investigations that Justice for Myanmar and yourselves have collaborated on. One of the major areas of investigation involves institutional shareholders who are linked to human rights violations in Myanmar through publicly listed companies. These include public pension funds that invest billions globally, and some of those involvements, as your work has uncovered, in companies that are supporting the Myanmar military. What did your investigations reveal about which European pension funds were invested in?
In 2021, we reported that Dash pension funds, ABP and PFZW, had invested $2.3 billion in companies linked to the Myanmar military, including firms with major ties to military conglomerates and the Army's Quartermaster General, such as Adani Ports and Kirin Holdings, both of which have since divested, partly due to investor pressure. Together with international partners, we also analyzed the French Pension Reserve Fund and French banks, revealing ongoing investments in companies connected to the Myanmar military, including in the lucrative oil and gas sector that finances the junta's international crimes. In Sweden, we provided data for AP fund investigations and co-published a briefer in November on 12 exposed companies. We found that AP funds had invested in Indian companies supplying arms and equipment to the junta, as well as Japanese multinationals KDDI and Sumitomo Corp, whose joint telecom operation with the junta has installed advanced surveillance and censorship technology in its data centers.
Why is this kind of financial investigation necessary for accountability around human rights?
Yeah, I'd say they're very important. One key aspect is that a lot of us, perhaps people in this room, perhaps people who are watching, may think of human rights violations, I don't know, as torture, war crimes, human trafficking, and they are. But actually, a lot of those violations can only happen if you have money. So unless we close the bank account, so to speak, a lot of these human rights violations will continue. So one is understanding that behind almost all human rights violations, there's a business interest. There's a profit to be made. Second is that for a lot of people, human rights violations may feel very distant. But the reality is not, as we've just heard, some of the human rights violations are very close to us. They may be companies that we purchase from, they may be companies that manage our investments, our pensions, or simply they may be a company you work for. And so accountability starts a little bit at home, so to speak, or certainly the information that we have. And so thanks to the work of JFM and many others, but especially them in the context of Myanmar, that information is coming to light. And knowing about it is essential. It's the first step to accountability.
We now turn to the aviation fuel investigation, which is another significant joint investigation by Justice for Myanmar and Amnesty International, which was tracing aviation fuel that is used by Myanmar's Air Force. The fuel is directly linked to airstrikes that have targeted civilians. Montse, how did this investigation begin?
Sure, I remember it very clearly. It was about a year plus after the coup, so it was around mid-2022. And at the time, a lot of CSOs, so civil society organizations like JFM, but also many others focused on Myanmar, were calling for a ban on aviation fuel, simply meaning companies, governments should not allow aviation fuel to enter Myanmar for the obvious reason that if the Myanmar military, the junta, doesn't have access to aviation fuel, then it can't fly its jets, its flight jets that are linked to war crimes and deadly airstrikes. But there was a gap in research. The question really was, well, which companies are directly involved? Which are the companies that are supplying the fuel? Which are then distributing in country? What's the infrastructure? So there was a bit of a research gap, and we decided to get involved in consultation with many CSOs. And of course, JFM was the first organization that we thought of because they have, their expertise is one of a kind in terms of understanding the financial links in country in Myanmar. And so we reached out to them. They had already started looking at this issue, and we decided to work together.
What methods did you use to trace the fuel from the suppliers to the military air bases?
At the time, there was widespread concern and inaccurate information about petroleum shipments to Myanmar. So we began by checking official data to identify which companies held permits to import, store, and distribute jet fuel. We mapped the corporate network enabling junta airstrikes. We then partnered with Amnesty International, who led the research for the deadly cargo report. Through leaked documents and online research, we used a process of elimination and found only one authorized network, the Myanmar-based Asia Zone Group of companies working with Puma, a Singapore-based petroleum corporation. We conducted further corporate mapping in Myanmar and Singapore, analyzed company disclosures, and reviewed leaked transport documents showing truck deliveries of aviation fuel to air bases. Whistleblowers working with us, and Amnesty also provided key information and leads.
Montse, what role did Amnesty play in this investigation?
So the partnership made a lot of sense because JFM was very much focused on everything happening in Myanmar. And we came in to bring in a couple of other angles. So one was, well, what companies are involved before? and at the time, of course, these companies have stopped engaging, but we found companies like Chevron, Exxon, Rosneft, big Thai Oil, big companies, suppliers involved. So our angle was to look at how can we put pressure and leverage on international companies, also shipping companies, insurance companies, all of them necessary for what we refer to as a supply chain. So the idea was that ultimately we could present to the public a full-on supply chain, meaning from the moment that the fuel leaves a refinery until the fuel is used in an airstrike that amounts to a war crime. So linking that up is what we did jointly. Our role was also looking at very specific kind of what's referred to as open source intelligence. So we looked at AIS data, which is shipping data where you see how vessels move, vessel tracking data. We use satellite imagery, both to confirm the location of ships, but also to confirm the infrastructure of storage tanks across the country. We'd also documented in-country violations, as in the effects of airstrikes.
What did you uncover about the human rights impact of this fuel supply chain?
This international aviation fuel supply chain we documented with Amnesty International is literally fueling the airstrikes that the junta is carrying out against civilians with impunity. The junta has increasingly relied on airstrikes to compensate for its loss of territorial control to resistance forces. It is also a strategy the junta uses to spread terror and in its failed attempts to gain control of Myanmar. Right now, the junta is increasing its aerial attacks. It has dropped bombs on hospitals and schools, murdered children, and results in mass forced displacement. According to UN figures, over 3.6 million have been displaced since the military's coup attempt. Without aviation fuel, the junta's jets cannot fly, so we and many other civil society groups demand a ban on aviation fuel exports to Myanmar, so as to stop these brutal aerial attacks on civilians. The junta's indiscriminate airstrikes are continuing. Governments must take further action to ban exports of aviation fuel to Myanmar.
Montse, why was this partnership important for human rights reporting and also strengthening the evidence in this case?
The reality is that no matter how large an NGO, a civil society organization is, the challenges that we face in this space are so overwhelming that you simply can't work on them alone. And so for us, partnering is always really important. Now, in this case, JFM is one of a kind. Their expertise is truly unparalleled. And so it was an obvious partnership in that sense. We both brought different things to the table. And I want to say, even though we've both said today how airstrikes have increased, unfortunately, aviation fuel is far more complicated now to enter Myanmar. It is more expensive. Now, anyway, I won't go into it now, but the supply chain has evolved through the years. And most importantly, when the report came out, countries that had said they wanted to take action on aviation fuel but hadn't started to. So you had the US, the UK, the EU, and others pass sanctions against the Myanmar entities involved. And I don't know if that sounds unprecedented or not, but it certainly was in that context. And the only reason why we were able to have such an immediate, significant impact and change by government actions was because we all worked together. And when I say we, it's JFM, Amnesty, and hundreds of CSOs that were working at the time calling for a ban on aviation fuel.
How do we then get businesses to think more about this and for investments as well, investors to think about how their work is linked to human rights?
Yeah, that's the perennial question in the space of business and human rights. Look, the reality is, my experience anyway, is that the vast majority of companies will prioritize profit over, I wouldn't say over human rights per se, but over human rights for the sake of human rights. They might prioritize other things when it amounts to legal risk for them. So for example, if there's a law that requires companies to conduct due diligence, before they engage in some kind of business transaction. Well, if not complying with that law has legal risk or even reputational risk, they'll keep it in mind. The reality, though, is there is no business and human rights treaty in the world. There are no obligations, for the most part, for companies to comply with human rights. So there's a massive gap when we look at the legal framework, the international legal framework, which is why domestically, in countries like Sweden and the EU, but also in Taiwan and South Korea, there are a number of countries around the world who are pushing for what's referred to as mandatory human rights due diligence laws. But I would say we're still very much at the beginning of this process, and we need to keep thinking about legal frameworks more than voluntary standards, because those, unfortunately, haven't worked.
Coming back to you, Justice for Myanmar, what are the possible scenarios for Myanmar over the next few years?
In the immediate term, the junta will escalate violence as it pushes ahead with its sham election. It is vital that governments reject this sham. Otherwise, they will only embolden the illegal junta and the terror it is inflicting on Myanmar people. Ending the Myanmar military cycle of impunity requires dismantling the military as an institution and recovering assets that belong to the Myanmar people that have been stolen through decades of dictatorship and grand corruption. If governments supported the Myanmar people's efforts to build a federal democracy, they could help speed up the junta's inevitable collapse and end the mass scales suffering it is inflicting on the people. This can be done by blocking the junta's access to funds, arms, equipment, and aviation fuel, which are vital to limit its capacity for mass atrocities, and by referring the situation in Myanmar to the International Criminal Court to end the military's blanket impunity.
Myanmar is one case, but it's not unique. What does this story tell us about how militaries and abusive regimes globally, and what is the scenario you hope for? More importantly, what concrete actions could shift the country from the likely path towards the better outcome?
Our work is not done alone. We are part of a wider movement to dismantle the Myanmar military cartel and hold criminal perpetrators to account. Authoritarian regimes and dictators prop each other up politically and financially for their own gain, entrenching impunity and committing international and transnational crimes while profiting from the suffering of the people. They are partners in crime, and their links must be cut through sanctions, divestments, criminal investigations, and global pressure. At the same time, support must go to democratic forces, building inclusive governance on the ground. Authoritarian networks are global, so accountability and support must also be global.
Who needs to act, and what are the tools or pressure could genuinely change the incentives of perpetrators?
Governments, corporations, and financial institutions all have leverage. The most effective tools include coordinated sanctions, targeting arms suppliers, aviation fuel, cronies, and military-linked businesses. Regulators must act and prosecute companies complicit in war crimes. Investors and pension funds must divest from enterprises tied to the junta's revenue streams.
Myanmar can feel very far away to people who are watching this from Western countries. What do you wish they understood about how their pension funds, banks, or governments are tied to the junta's power?
Myanmar may feel far away, but its struggle is deeply connected to global movements for justice. Standing with Myanmar is standing for the principle that people everywhere deserve freedom and the power to shape their own future. We also want to urge governments to support the Myanmar people's struggle for federal democracy and for justice, and to keep supporting civil society and independent media. Sweden's recent decision to end its funding for human rights and civil society in Myanmar is very concerning and can cost lives. We urge the Swedish government to rethink this and support the Myanmar people's struggle. We hope that in receiving this award, we can convey the courage of the people of Myanmar, the people's immense strength to fight for peace, and the struggle to dismantle the military cartel.
Montse, do you have any closing words from Amnesty about this partnership and what is at stake in Myanmar?
I'm here. JFM is not. There's an empty chair here. And that's not a coincidence. That's because people like them who speak truth to power are in hiding, and they will remain until things change drastically in Myanmar. And if the Myanmar military thinks that they're winning because they're not here, they're wrong. They might be winning the fight for land, but they're not winning the fight for hearts. And on those closing words, I want to say congratulations to Justice for Myanmar for their incredible bravery, still today continuing despite all the challenges and security risks to them.
Indeed, and thank you, Montse Ferrer from Amnesty International, for joining us on this deep dive interview. Congratulations again to Justice for Myanmar, this year's winner of the Right Livelihood Award. Thank you for joining us.